September the 6th, 1943. 14:47 hours, 8,000 feet above the English Channel. Staff Sergeant Everett Kellerman sat in the tail gunner position of B-17F serial number 4, 2-30177 call sign, Nighthawk, watching his ammunition counter click down to a number that made survival mathematically impossible. 63 rounds remaining. The left gun was destroyed. A 20mm cannon shell had punched through the receiver at 11:31 that morning, the same burst that buried 11 fragments of German steel in his arm, shoulder and scalp. Blood had pooled on the compartment floor and frozen solid in the sub-zero air. His flight suit was glued to the bicycle seat that served as his workstation, 87 nautical miles to the English coast. 4, maybe 6 German fighters still hunting somewhere in the sky behind him. The training manual said a tail gunner needed minimum 30 rounds per engagement to have any chance of hitting a target moving at combined closure speeds approaching 600 miles per hour. Kellerman did the mathematics. 63 rounds divided by 5 fighters equaled 12.6 rounds per engagement, insufficient ammunition to defend the aircraft, insufficient ammunition to protect 9 men who were depending on him to get them home. 12 hours earlier, he had loaded 1,200 rounds into the feed trays of his 2 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns. 1,200 rounds, now 63. The story of how those bullets disappeared would change the way the United States Army Air Forces fought the air war over Europe. It would save thousands of lives. It would prove that sometimes the doctrine designed to keep men alive was actually killing them. But first, Kellerman had to survive the next 87 miles. The temperature outside the plexiglass bubble was 48 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Inside, his electrically heated suit had stopped working an hour ago when the hydraulic fluid leak shorted the connections. He could no longer feel his left hand. His right hand, wrapped around the grip of his remaining functional gun, moved mostly on muscle memory and determination. Through blood-smeared plexiglass, he watched the grey water of the English Channel pass below. Somewhere ahead, the white cliffs of Dover marked safety. Somewhere behind the European coastline marked death. Nighthawk hung suspended between the two, dying slowly from accumulated battle damage, fuel starvation and physics. The intercom crackled. Pilot Lieutenant Donald Warren's voice strained but steady. "Tail gunner status." Kellerman keyed his microphone. His throat was so dry the first attempt produced no sound. He swallowed, tried again. "One gun functional. 63 rounds. No contacts." A pause. Warren knew what those numbers meant. Every man in the crew knew. "Copy. Keep watching R6. We're not home yet." Kellerman released the microphone switch and went back to scanning the sky. The loneliest job in the war, they called it. The tail gunner worked alone, separated from the rest of the crew by 40 feet of aluminum fuselage. No one to talk to, no one to help if something went wrong. Just a man, 2 guns that were now 1 gun, and whatever the Luftwaffe sent his way. The statistics told their own story. In the summer of 1943, the average B-17 crew survived 11 missions before being shot down, killed, or captured. Tail gunners died faster than anyone except ball turret gunners. 71% mortality rate. The Germans preferred attacking from the rear. The tail position absorbed the first bullets, the first cannon shells, the first disintegrating rounds designed to shred aluminum and flesh with equal efficiency. Kellerman had just completed his 20th mission. He had beaten the average by 9 missions. By rights, he should have been dead weeks ago. The fact that he was still breathing, still fighting, still watching the empty sky for black dots that would become Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs was due entirely to a decision he had made 71 days earlier. A decision to break the rules. The tail gunner position in a B-17F flying fortress measured 4 feet wide, 5 feet long and 4.5 feet tall at its highest point. The dimensions were not generous. Kellerman was 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighed 162 pounds. When he crawled into position for a mission, he became part of the aircraft. The bicycle seat bolted to the floor was his chair for 6, 8, sometimes 10 hours. The 2 Browning M2 machine guns pointing backward through the plexiglass window were his tools. The view of empty sky clouds and occasionally the entire Luftwaffe fighter force was his office. The guns themselves were manufactured by Browning Arms Company, chambered for 50 caliber ammunition capable of firing between 750 and 850 rounds per minute, depending on temperature and maintenance. Each gun fed from a 400-round ammunition box, giving a standard combat load of 800 rounds total. The effective range, according to the manual, was 200 to 600 yards. According to the manual, Kellerman had stopped trusting the manual on June 17, 1943. That was the day he watched Staff Sergeant Robert Whitmore die because he followed the manual exactly as written. The mission had been St. Nazaire, the submarine pens on the French coast. The 379th Bombardment Group had put up 18 aircraft that morning. 17 came home. The one that did not was B-17. F serial number 4, 2-29846, call sign, Liberty Bell. Bobby Whitmore had been the tail gunner, 22 years old, 7 missions completed. He did everything the training instructors at gunnery school had taught him. He waited for the enemy to close to 300 yards before opening fire. He aimed carefully. He fired in short controlled bursts to conserve ammunition. He was disciplined, professional, and exactly the kind of gunner the Army Air Forces wanted. At 9:42 and 18 seconds, 2 Messerschmitt Bf-109G fighters were spotted approaching Liberty Bell from 6 o'clock, low range, 1,200 yards. Bobby Whitmore identified them, called them out over the intercom, and waited. The manual said to wait. Ammunition was limited. Accuracy mattered more than volume of fire. A disciplined gunner could make 800 rounds last an entire mission. At 9:42 and 44 seconds, the lead German fighter reached 600 yards and opened fire. His 2 20mm MG-151 cannons and 2 13mm MG-131 machine guns sent a stream of high-explosive and armor-piercing rounds toward Liberty Bell's tail section. Bobby Whitmore still held his fire. 600 yards was too far. The manual said 300 yards. The manual was written by men who had studied ballistics and probability and combat effectiveness in classrooms far from the sky over France. At 9:42 and 47 seconds, the first 20mm shells struck Liberty Bell's tail. At 9:42 and 49 seconds, the plexiglass bubble shattered and Bobby Whitmore's position was torn open by cannon fire. At 9:42 and 51 seconds, Whitmore attempted to return fire. He never completed the trigger pull. At 9:42 and 53 seconds, Liberty Bell's tail controls were severed and the bomber fell out of formation, trailing smoke and pieces of structure. 8 parachutes deployed. Bobby Whitmore was not among them. The aircraft impacted the French countryside at 9:57 hours. 2 crew members survived to be captured. The rest died on impact or in the subsequent fire. Kellerman had watched it happen from 300 yards away. He had watched Bobby Whitmore wait for the manual's prescribed engagement range. He had watched his friend die following the rules exactly as written. That night, while the rest of the crew tried to sleep, Kellerman sat in the barracks and did mathematics. A Focke-Wulf FW190A5 approaching from 6 o'clock at 350 miles per hour. A B-17F Flying Fortress cruising at 180 miles per hour. Combined closure rate 530 miles per hour. At 600 yards, the German pilot had approximately 8.7 seconds of firing time before passing the bomber. The FW190 carried 2 20mm cannons with an effective range of 600 to 800 yards. The fatal gap. German pilots opened fire at 600 yards or beyond. American tail gunners waited until 300 yards. For 4 to 5 seconds, the Americans absorbed incoming fire without returning it. In a fight measured in seconds and fractions of seconds, that gap was the difference between survival and death. Kellerman decided the manual was wrong. Bobby Whitmore had waited and died. The next mission, Kellerman would try something different. June 22nd, 1943. Mission 7, Wilhelmshaven. The bomber stream crossed into German airspace at 11:17 hours. The Luftwaffe found them 6 minutes later. 2 Focke-Wulf FW190A5 fighters engines producing 1,700 horsepower, each armed with 2 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns climbing toward the formation from 4 o'clock low. Kellerman watched them come. 900 yards, 800, 750. The standard doctrine said to wait. The manual said 300 yards. Every instructor, every training flight, every briefing hammered the same message. Discipline, fire control, ammunition conservation. At 720 yards, Kellerman squeezed both triggers. The 2 Browning M2 machine guns roared to life. Tracers arced across the sky, bright orange lines connecting Nighthawk's tail to the empty air in front of the approaching fighters. At that range, the rounds were falling short, disappearing into nothing 300 feet below the German aircraft. Kellerman held the triggers down, watching the tracers climb, adjusting his aim based on where the rounds were going, not where the gun sight said they should go. 11 seconds, 87 rounds expended from each gun, 174 total. The two German fighters broke off their attack at 500 yards, diving away before reaching effective firing range. They had seen the tracers streaming toward them. They had watched the rounds climb closer with each passing second. Fighter pilots were not suicidal. When they saw defensive fire coming at them from ranges that should have been safe, they maneuvered. The human instinct to avoid visible incoming fire overrode tactical planning. Kellerman had not hit either aircraft. He had fired 174 rounds and scored 0 hits, but Nighthawk took 0 damage. The German fighters withdrew. The bomber continued to target. After landing, the crew chief examined the ammunition expenditure logs. "You burned through 174 rounds and didn't hit anything," the crew chief said. "At this rate, you'll be empty before we reach Hamburg." Kellerman looked at the undamaged tail section. No bullet holes, no cannon shell impacts, no shredded plexiglass. 174 rounds brought us 0 damage, he said. Bobby Whitmore held 400 rounds and died. I'll take my odds. Word spread through the 527th Bombardment Squadron. The tail gunner on Nighthawk was violating doctrine, wasting ammunition on long-range shots. Some called it reckless. The squadron gunnery officer, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, filed a negative report. But Nighthawk kept landing with its full crew intact. Other bombers in the squadron were not so fortunate. Between June 23rd and July 29th, Kellerman flew 5 more missions: Bremen, Hanover, Hamburg, Kiel, Warnemünde. He refined his technique with each mission, learning to read the attack angles, predict the fighter's path, start firing early enough to force the German pilot into defensive maneuvering before establishing a stable gun platform. Mission 8 Bremen, June 23rd. 2 engagements, 164 rounds expended. 1 Bf-109 probably destroyed. Nighthawk returned undamaged. Mission 9, Hanover, June 29th. 3 engagements, 211 rounds, 0 confirmed kills but 3 forced breakoffs. The German fighters approached, saw the early defensive fire and chose easier targets. Nighthawk returned undamaged. Mission 10 Hamburg, July 7th. 4 engagements, 287 rounds, 1 Bf-109 confirmed destroyed. Kellerman had walked his tracers up from 650 yards, adjusting continuously until the rounds began connecting at 400 yards. The Messerschmitt's engine had erupted in white smoke and glycol coolant. The aircraft had rolled inverted and descended in a shallow dive, trailing smoke. Confirmed kill. Nighthawk returned with minor flak damage, no fighter damage. Mission 11 Kiel, July 18th. 1 engagement, 73 rounds, 1 FW-190, confirmed destroyed at 520 yards. The fighter had approached in a climbing turn, exposing its belly. Kellerman's burst had struck the wing root and fuel tank. The Fokker-Wulf had exploded. Confirmed kill. Nighthawk returned undamaged. Mission 12, Warnemünde, July 29th. 2 engagements, 156 rounds, 1 probable. Nighthawk returned undamaged. By July 29th, Kellerman's running totals told their own story. 891 rounds expended across 5 missions, 3 confirmed kills, 2 probables. Nighthawk had absorbed minor flak damage on several missions, but had not taken a single hit from enemy fighters. The squadron comparison was harder to ignore. During the same period, the 527th Squadron had flown 47 missions. 3 aircraft had been lost to fighters, 30 men killed or missing, 4 tail gunners killed, including replacements for the lost aircraft. The other tail gunners, following standard doctrine, had collectively scored 5 confirmed kills across 43 surviving missions. Average ammunition usage 340 rounds per mission. Kellerman was using more than twice the ammunition and scoring kills at 3 times the rate. More importantly, he was alive. Lieutenant Webb, the squadron gunnery officer, requested the gun camera footage from Nighthawk's missions. The film showed what the statistics suggested. Kellerman's tracers reached out to 600, 700, sometimes 800 yards. The German fighters, seeing the fire coming before they expected it, initiated evasive maneuvers early. Their attack accuracy degraded by an estimated 40 to 60% when forced to jink and maneuver instead of holding steady. Webb wrote a memo dated July 23rd. Technique is unorthodox but demonstrably effective. Recommend continued observation and data collection. The observation came sooner than anyone expected. While Kellerman was developing his technique over occupied Europe, Luftwaffe intelligence officers were developing their own observations. German fighter pilots were debriefing after every mission, reporting what they saw, what worked, what did not. By late July, a pattern had emerged. American tail gunners were changing their behavior. The safe approach ranges that had worked for months were no longer safe. Some gunners were opening fire at 600 and 700 meters. The tracer visibility at extended range was forcing German pilots to maneuver earlier, degrading attack accuracy. The psychological effect was significant. Even when the rounds were falling short, the visual stimulus of incoming fire triggered instinctive defensive reactions. Hauptmann Klaus Mertens, Staffelkapitän of the 4th Staffeljagdgeschwader 26, filed a report after the Hamburg mission on July the 28th. The report noted the tactical shift and recommended 3 countermeasures. Increase approach velocity to reduce exposure time. Attack from steeper angles where gravity would assist the pullout. Identify and prioritize the aggressive gunners. The Luftwaffe was adapting. Kellermann's innovation was creating an arms race. The question was whether the adaptation would succeed before the technique spread to other tail gunners. The answer came on July 30th, 1943. Mission 13. Kassel. The briefing began at 4:30 hours. The target was the Henschel aircraft factories in Kassel, Germany. 500 net to 20 nautical miles penetration. 186 B-17F flying fortresses would make the run. 123 P-47D Thunderbolts would provide escort as far as the Belgian border. After that, the bombers would fly alone for 217 nautical miles through the heart of German air defenses. Intelligence estimated 300 or more Luftwaffe fighters along the route. Kellermann loaded 1,200 rounds that morning instead of the standard 800. 400 rounds in each gun plus an additional 400 rounds in improvised reserve containers. The crew chief raised an eyebrow but said nothing. If the tail gunner wanted to carry extra weight, that was his business. The formation crossed the English Channel at 9:15 hours, climbing through 14,000 feet toward the mission altitude of 25,000. The P-47 escorts held position around the bomber stream, their distinctive profiles reassuring against the morning sky. But Kellermann knew the mathematics. The Thunderbolts carried enough fuel for roughly 90 minutes of combat flying. The mission to Kassel would take 6 hours round trip. For most of the journey, the bombers would be alone. At 11:34 hours over eastern Belgium, the P-47s waggled their wings and turned back toward England. Their fuel gauges demanded retreat. The bombers pressed on into Germany. At 11:42 hours, the first Messerschmitts appeared. Kellermann counted 8, then 12, then 20, then stopped counting. The sky behind the bomber formation filled with black crosses on yellow noses. Bf-109GS from multiple Geschwader coordinating their attacks, positioning themselves in staggered altitude brackets. The lead fighter began its attack run from 6 o'clock high diving toward the formation at 400 miles per hour. Kellermann tracked the aircraft through his gun sight, watching the wingspan grow larger with each passing second. 800 yards, 750, 700. He squeezed both triggers. The twin Brownings hammered, sending a stream of tracers across the sky. The first rounds fell short, disappearing into empty air below the diving fighter. Kellermann adjusted, walking the fire upward, leading the target, compensating for closure rate and gravity and the peculiar ballistics of 50 caliber rounds at 25,000 feet, where the air was thin and cold. At 600 yards, the tracers began connecting. Bright flashes sparked along the Messerschmitt's engine cowling. The German pilot broke hard right smoke, trailing from his aircraft. He never completed his firing pass. The fighter spiraled downward, disappearing into the cloud layer below. Probable kill, no time to confirm. The second attacker was already closing. This one came in lower, trying to slip beneath Kellermann's field of fire, forcing him to depress the guns nearly to their mechanical limit. Difficult angle, difficult shot. Kellermann fired anyway, sending a long burst toward the approaching Fokker-Wulf. The German pilot flinched, pulling up early, releasing his cannon shells into empty sky above Nighthawk. The bomber shuddered from near misses but took no direct hits. The attacks continued for 47 minutes. Wave after wave of German fighters slashed through the bomber formation, targeting stragglers and damaged aircraft. Kellermann fired at everything that came within range, burning through ammunition at 3 times the recommended rate. His gun barrels glowed red from sustained fire. The temperature in the tail compartment climbed to 10 degrees above zero despite the outside air temperature of -60. At 12:29 hours, a Bf-109G6 approached from directly astern, flying straight and level. The pilot had either extraordinary courage or poor judgment. Kellermann centered the fighter in his gun sight and held both triggers down for 6.2 continuous seconds. 163 rounds hammered into the approaching aircraft. The Messerschmitt's engine blocks shattered. The cockpit disintegrated. The wings folded backward from the airframe. What remained of the fighter tumbled past Nighthawk close enough for Kellermann to see inside the empty cockpit. The pilot had either ejected or died at the controls. Confirmed kill number 6. Ammunition remaining 485 rounds. The formation reached Kassel at 12:51 hours and began the bombing run. For 11 minutes the bombers flew straight and level, unable to maneuver, while the bombardiers lined up their targets through the Norden bomb sites. The Luftwaffe knew this moment represented maximum vulnerability. The fighters pressed their attacks with renewed fury. At 12:57 hours, a Focke-Wulf FW190A6 Dove on Nighthawk from 5 o'clock high. Kellerman swung his guns to meet it, firing a burst of 42 rounds. The rounds struck the fighter's wing root. The pilot kept coming. The FW190's cannons opened fire. 20mm shells tore through Nighthawk's tail section in a diagonal line from upper right to lower left. Kellerman felt the impacts before he felt the pain. The left gun's receiver exploded, shrapnel spraying across the compartment. Fragments buried themselves in his left arm, his shoulder, the left side of his scalp. Hydraulic fluid erupted from severed lines, coating everything in slick red liquid that froze almost instantly. The plexiglass spider-webbed with cracks. The left gun was destroyed. Inoperable. Gone. Kellerman kept firing with the right gun, one hand on the grip, blood running down his arm, vision partially obscured by the blood on his face and the cracks in the plexiglass. He tracked the wounded Focke-Wulf as it pulled away from its attack run. One-handed, 67 rounds. The burst caught the FW190's tail assembly. The aircraft snap-rolled and dove toward the ground 8,000 feet below. Confirmed kill number 7. The intercom crackled with voices. Someone asking about damage, someone else reporting flak ahead. Kellerman tried to respond, but his throat had gone dry. Blood pooled on the floor of his compartment, freezing in the sub-zero air. Ammunition remaining 376 rounds, one functional gun, 11 pieces of German steel embedded in his body. The mission was only half over. Nighthawk still had to fly 267 nautical miles back to England through the same gauntlet of fighters that had nearly killed him on the way in. Kellerman wrapped a scarf around his wounded arm and waited for the next attack. August 19th, 1943. 20 days after Kassel. Flight surgeon Captain Gregory Henderson removed the final bandages from Kellerman's left arm. The wounds had healed cleanly, leaving 11 scars in irregular patterns across the flesh. 2 fragments remained embedded too deep for safe extraction. They would stay with Kellerman for the rest of his life, small pieces of German steel that the X-rays showed as bright white specks against bone. "Full range of motion," Henderson said, watching Kellerman flex and extend the arm. "No nerve damage. No arterial complications. You are cleared for return to flight duty." "When can I fly?" "Tomorrow if the squadron needs you, but take it easy. Your body has absorbed significant trauma." Kellerman returned to the barracks and found his gear. The electrically heated flight suit cleaned and patched where the shrapnel had torn through. The throat microphone, the leather gloves with the trigger fingers cut away for better sensitivity on the gun grips. The tools that had kept him alive through 13 missions. Nighthawk had a new aircraft waiting. The old B-17F serial number 42-30177 had accumulated too much battle damage over Kassel for economical repair. The maintenance crews had stripped her for salvageable parts and scrapped the rest. The replacement carried the same name, the same nose art of a hawk, clutching lightning bolts, the same radio call sign. But she was not the same bomber. Different serial number, different engine history, different aluminum skin that had never been tested by German cannon fire. The crew was different too. 4 men had completed their 25 mission requirement and rotated back to the United States. Pilot Lieutenant Donald Warren remained, as did navigator Harrison Caldwell and 3 others. But the replacements were young, fresh from stateside training, untested in combat. They looked at Kellerman with expressions mixing curiosity and caution. The tail gunner, who had scored 7 confirmed kills in a single mission. The man the other gunners whispered about, the one who broke the rules and survived. But Kellerman understood something the replacements did not. He had not changed anything fundamental yet. He had proven a technique worked for 1 aircraft across 13 missions. The real test would come when the technique spread to other crews, when dozens of tail gunners adopted it, when the Luftwaffe developed systematic countermeasures. Innovation only mattered if it survived enemy adaptation. While Kellerman had been recovering in the station hospital, events had been unfolding across multiple fronts. In the 527th Bombardment Squadron, 3 other tail gunners had begun experimenting with early engagement tactics. Their results were promising. In 8th Bomber Command Headquarters, staff officers were reviewing preliminary data on defensive gunnery effectiveness. The numbers suggested something significant. And across the English Channel in occupied Europe, Luftwaffe intelligence officers were conducting their own analysis. Major Franz Götz, Gruppenkommandeur of the 2nd Gruppe Jagdgeschwader 26, had called a tactical conference at Deelen Air Base in the Netherlands on September 3rd. The assembled Staffelkapiteine represented some of the most experienced fighter units in the Western Theater. They had a problem. American bomber defensive fire is evolving, Götz told them, displaying a chart of German fighter losses. Our pilots report tail gunners opening fire at 600, 700, in some cases 800 meters. This is significantly beyond their previous engagement ranges. The chart showed the cost. Fighter losses to bomber defensive fire had increased 23% in August compared to July. German pilots killed while approaching from astern were up 31%. Attack runs aborted due to early defensive fire had jumped 40%. The tactical problem is both mechanical and psychological, Götz continued. When a pilot sees tracer fire coming at ranges he believes to be safe, he maneuvers instinctively. The evasive action disrupts his firing solution. His accuracy degrades. The bomber survives. We lose aircraft. The Staffelkapitän discussed countermeasures, increase approach velocity by diving from higher altitude, trading excess height for speed to minimize exposure time. The problem was that higher speed meant less time to aim, resulting in lower hit probability. Attack from steeper angles to complicate the gunner's tracking solution. The problem was that steeper dives required precise altitude positioning and made target tracking through the gun sight more difficult. Target the aggressive gunners, specifically eliminating the threat before it could spread to other aircraft. The problem was identification. In the chaos of 100 aircraft formation being attacked by 50 fighters, simultaneously identifying which specific bomber had the aggressive tail gunner was nearly impossible. None of these solutions addresses the fundamental issue, one Staffelkapitän observed. The Americans have found a method that exploits basic human instinct. A pilot seeing incoming fire will maneuver regardless of training. This is not a discipline problem. This is psychology, Götz nodded. We must assume the technique will spread. Revise attack doctrine accordingly. The 6 o'clock stern approach can no longer be considered the guaranteed kill opportunity it represented 3 months ago. The Luftwaffe was adapting. The race was on. Would German tactical evolution outpace American doctrine change, or would the innovation spreading through the 8th Air Force bomber groups shift the balance before the Luftwaffe could counter it effectively? On August 26th, Kellerman climbed back into a tail gunner position for the first time since Kassel. Mission 14. The target was Stuttgart, deep in southern Germany. The mission scrubbed due to weather before the formation reached the French coast. 5 hours of flying in circles over England. 0 fighters engaged. 0 rounds fired. Kellerman returned to base with his ammunition boxes still full and his guns cold. Mission 15 came on August 31st. Amiens occupied France. The target was a railroad marshalling yard. Light opposition. 2 brief engagements as German fighters made half-hearted passes at the formation. Kellerman fired 47 rounds total, forcing both attackers to break off early. 1 probable kill when a BAF-109 trailed smoke after his burst connected, but the aircraft disappeared into clouds and could not be confirmed. Nighthawk returned with minor flak damage and no fighter hits. Mission 16, September 2nd, German airfields near Paris. Moderate opposition. The Luftwaffe defended their bases aggressively. 3 separate engagements. Kellerman expended 83 rounds. 1 confirmed kill, a Bf-109G hit. At 560 yards, the engine erupting in white glycol smoke, the pilot bailing out while the aircraft was still in controlled flight. Nighthawk took flak damage to the left wing, but no fighter damage. Mission 17, September the 3rd, became a nightmare. The target was Stuttgart again, the mission that had scrubbed a week earlier due to weather. This time the weather was clear. The Luftwaffe was waiting. The 100th Bombardment Group, flying in a different section of the combat box, was hit by concentrated mass attacks. 30 to 40 German fighters hitting simultaneously from multiple angles, overwhelming defensive fire through sheer numbers. 8 B-17s from the 100th fell in 15 minutes, 80 men gone. The 379th escaped the worst of the slaughter through luck of position within the formation. The German fighters had chosen different targets. But Kellerman watched it happen from his tail position, saw the bombers falling out of formation, trailing smoke and fire, counted the parachutes that deployed and the ones that did not. The lesson was brutal and clear. Early engagement tactics worked against small groups of fighters. Against massed assault, no amount of defensive fire could stop them all. The Luftwaffe had found their counter. Concentration of force, overwhelming numbers applied to specific targets. If you could not defeat the defensive fire, you could drown it in simultaneous attacks that exceeded the gunner's ability to engage all threats. Kellerman returned from Mission 17, understanding that the tactical advantage his methods provided was temporary and situation-dependent. The air war was a contest of innovation and counter-innovation, both sides studying, adapting, searching for the next edge. The moment you stopped evolving, you died. By early September, Lieutenant Marcus Webb's preliminary analysis was complete. The squadron gunnery officer had compiled data from 3 months of operations. The correlation between early engagement techniques and improved survival rates was statistically significant. Webb forwarded his report to the 379th Bombardment Group commander with a recommendation for immediate review of defensive gunnery doctrine. Colonel Morris Preston read the report and added his own note before sending it up the chain to 8th Bomber Command headquarters. Combat data indicates current doctrine may be contributing to unnecessary casualties. Recommend urgent review. The bureaucratic process would take weeks. Combat operations did not wait. The mission briefing for September 6th began at 4:30 hours in the operations hut at RAF Kimbolton. Kellerman sat with the other gunners listening to the intelligence officer describe the target. Stuttgart. Again, the 3rd time in 10 days. The Bosch Electrical Works and ball-bearing manufacturing facilities. Strategic importance rated maximum. Expected opposition rated heavy to severe. The route profile appeared on the wall map. 511 nautical miles penetration into southern Germany, the deepest strike 8 Bomber Command had attempted that month. The red yarn stretched from England across the Channel, over France and Belgium deep into the Reich, then back again. Total flight time 6 hours 40 minutes. P-47 Thunderbolt escorts would accompany the formation as far as their fuel allowed, which intelligence estimated at the Belgian border. After that, the bombers would fly alone for 4 hours 15 minutes through the most heavily defended airspace in Europe. Navigator Harrison Caldwell did the mathematics during the briefing. Based on previous Stuttgart missions, intelligence predicted 20 to 30 separate fighter attacks during the unescorted portion. Using Kellerman's engagement technique of early fire at extended range, estimated ammunition requirement would be 1,200 to 1,500 rounds. Kellerman made his decision. He would load 1,200 rounds, 400 in each of the 2 gun boxes, plus 400 in improvised reserve containers. The extra weight would affect aircraft performance marginally, but ammunition seemed more important than saving a few pounds. Crew Chief Technical Sergeant William O'Malley watched Kellerman prepare the guns in the pre-dawn darkness. "Heavy load for 1 mission," O'Malley observed. "Heavy opposition expected," Kellerman replied, checking the feed mechanism on both Browning M2 machine guns. "You think it will be bad?" Kellerman looked at the crew chief. O'Malley had been maintaining aircraft at Kimbolton since the 379th arrived in England. He had seen bombers return shot to pieces. He had seen them not return at all. He knew what Stuttgart meant. "I think the 3rd time we hit a target, the Luftwaffe knows we are coming," Kellerman said. "I think they will be waiting with everything they have, and I think 1,200 rounds might not be enough." The formation launched at 5:40 hours. 187 B-17F flying fortresses climbed into the pre-dawn sky, joining up over the North Sea in a carefully choreographed aerial ballet. Nighthawk flew in the lead element of the 379th formation. Lead position meant navigating for the groups following behind. It also meant absorbing the first attacks from any direction. Kellerman settled into his position as the bomber climbed through 10,000 feet. The bicycle seat, the 2 guns pointing aft through plexiglass, the view of empty sky that would soon fill with enemy fighters. This was his office. This was where he worked. The bomber stream crossed the English Channel at 9:15 hours, the white cliffs of Dover falling away behind occupied France spreading ahead. The P-47 escorts held formation around the bombers, their presence reassuring, but temporary. Kellerman knew the arithmetic. The Thunderbolts would turn back in less than 2 hours. The bombers would continue alone into Germany. At 9:15 hours, the first German fighters appeared over France. Messerschmitts and Fokker-Wulfs climbing from airfields across the region, positioning themselves for the intercept. The initial attacks came from 11 o'clock head-on passes, testing the nose gunners and top turret rather than the tail. Kellerman waited and watched. Behind the formation, contrails multiplied, more fighters climbing to altitude. The Luftwaffe was assembling a major force. By 09:40 hours, intelligence estimates counted over 100 interceptors tracking the bomber stream. This was not opportunistic harassment by individual staffon. This was coordinated. planned, maximum effort. The P-47 escorts waggled their wings at 10:02 hours and turned back toward England. Fuel gauges demanded retreat. The bombers pressed on alone into the heart of the Reich. The rear attacks began at 10:08 hours. 12 Bf-109G fighters positioned themselves 2,000 feet below the formation, then pulled up in a climbing attack from 6 o'clock low. The maneuver was executed with practiced precision. These were not novice pilots. These were veterans who knew exactly what they were doing. Kellerman opened fire at 700 yards. The twin Brownings hammered tracers arcing across the sky toward the climbing fighters. 2 aircraft broke off immediately, unwilling to face early defensive fire. A third took hits along the engine cowling and fell away, trailing white smoke and glycol coolant. The remaining 9 pressed their attack, spreading laterally to split Kellerman's attention across multiple targets. Cannon shells ripped through the bomber formation. The B-17, flying 300 yards off Nighthawk's left wing, took direct hits to No. 3 engine. The cowling shredded. Oil streamed back along the wing in black ribbons. Another bomber in the low squadron began trailing fuel vapor from punctured wing tanks, the volatile liquid evaporating in the slipstream, creating a visible trail that marked the aircraft as wounded. Kellerman kept firing, shifting from target to target as fighters flashed through his field of view. His ammunition counter dropped. 600 rounds remaining. 500. 400. The attacks showed no sign of diminishing. At 10:23 hours, 3 Fokker-Wulf FW190s appeared at 8 o'clock high, diving in precise line astern formation. Kellerman engaged the lead aircraft at 620 yards. 43 rounds, bright flashes along the wing root and fuselage as rounds connected. The FW190 continued its dive, but the pilot's aim was disrupted by the hits. Cannon shells passed above Nighthawk, overshooting by 30 feet. The second fighter adjusted, compensating for the lead aircraft's error. Kellerman swung right, fired 18 rounds, forced the pilot into an evasive jink. The third fighter came through untouched, his cannon fire stitching a line of holes across Nighthawk's left wing between the No. 1 and No. 2 engines. Metal torn, hydraulic lines severed, but the engines kept running. 3 fighters driven off. 61 rounds expended. Kellerman's ammunition counter showed 242 rounds remaining. The math was turning bad. They had not even reached the target yet. The formation penetrated deeper into Germany. The attacks continued in waves. Groups of 4, groups of 6, occasionally a single fighter making a high-speed pass and diving away before defensive fire could track it. Kellerman fired at everything that came within range. Conservative bursts now, 12 rounds, 15, 20. Every round had to count. At 10:47 hours, a pair of Bf-109Gs approached from 7 o'clock low. Kellerman waited until 500 yards, then fired a precise 12-round burst at the lead fighter. The tracers struck home. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and dove away, trailing coolant from a punctured radiator. The wingman broke off without attacking, following his element leader down. 2 fighters driven away. 12 rounds expended, 230 remaining. Nighthawk crossed into southern Germany at 10:52 hours. Stuttgart was 12 minutes ahead. 12 minutes of straight and level flight during the bomb run. 12 minutes when the bombers could not maneuver while the bombardiers lined up their Norden bomb sites. The Luftwaffe knew this moment represented maximum vulnerability. At 11:04 hours, the formation began its bombing approach. The bomber stream steadied on course, airspeed, constant altitude locked. Sitting ducks for 600 seconds. The German fighters attacked with renewed intensity. At 11:09 hours, a staffel of 8 FW190s hit the formation from multiple angles simultaneously. Kellerman engaged targets as they appeared, firing short bursts, forcing defensive maneuvers, protecting Nighthawk's vulnerable tail. His ammunition counter clicked downward. 190 rounds, 170, 150. At 11:14 hours, bombs away. The formation released its payload over Stuttgart. 12,000 pounds of high explosive from each aircraft. The bombardier's voice came over the intercom. "Bombs away! Good hits on target!" Nighthawk was no longer committed to straight and level flight. The pilots could maneuver now, but the relief was temporary. They still had to fly 511 nautical miles back through the same fighters that had attacked them on the way in. At 11:17 hours, Kellerman's left gun jammed. A malfunction in the feed mechanism. He cleared it, reloaded, got the gun running again. Cost 40 seconds of non-functional defensive fire. Cost 1 attacking Bf-109 that came within 300 yards before Kellerman could engage it with the right gun only. At 11:23 hours, ammunition remaining 108 rounds. At 11:31 hours, a Focke-Wulf FW190A-8 Dove on Nighthawk from directly above and behind, using the sun to mask its approach until the last possible moment. This was not the first time Kellerman had been hit. Over Kassel 5 weeks earlier, he had taken 11 shrapnel wounds and lost his left gun temporarily. The wounds had healed. The gun had been repaired and replaced. But now over Stuttgart, at 11,200 feet above southern Germany, history was about to repeat itself with brutal precision. Kellerman spotted the FW190 too late. The fighter was already firing. 20mm MG151 cannon shells punched through Nighthawk's tail section in a diagonal pattern from upper right to lower left. The first shell struck the left gun's receiver, detonating on impact. The gun exploded. Metal fragments sprayed across the compartment. Kellerman felt multiple impacts across both arms, his chest, his face, warm blood, cold air. The temperature differential created immediate shock. The hydraulic system ruptured. Red fluid erupted under pressure, coating everything, freezing on contact with the -52-degree air. The plexiglass spider-webbed with cracks. One panel shattered completely, allowing the full force of the 200-mile-per-hour slipstream into the compartment. Kellerman's left gun was gone, destroyed, inoperable. He kept firing with the right gun, one hand on the grip, blood running down both arms, vision partially obscured by blood on his face and the spiderweb cracks in the remaining plexiglass. He tracked the Focke-Wulf as it pulled up from its attack run, the German pilot initiating his escape maneuver. Kellerman fired 89 rounds in a sustained burst, one-handed, wounded, half-blind. The rounds walked up the FW190's fuselage, struck the tail assembly, severed control cables. The German fighter snap-rolled violently and entered an uncontrolled spin. Kellerman watched it tumble past Nighthawk's left wing, falling toward the German countryside 8,000 feet below. Probable kill, maybe confirmed. He had no way of knowing and no time to watch. His left gun was destroyed. His ammunition counter showed 19 rounds remaining, and Nighthawk was in serious trouble. The fighter's cannon fire had done more than destroy the gun. Hydraulic lines were severed, tail control cables were damaged, fuel tanks in the wing roots showed signs of leakage. The pilots were fighting to maintain control of an aircraft that was responding poorly to inputs. The formation turned westward at 11:42 hours, beginning the long flight home. Nighthawk struggled to hold position. Number 2 engine was running rough oil pressure fluctuating. Number 3 engine was losing power exhaust gas temperature, climbing into the red zone. At 12:15 hours, number 3 engine died. The pilots feathered the propeller, stopping its rotation to reduce drag. Nighthawk fell slightly behind the formation, unable to maintain speed on 3 engines with battle damage affecting aerodynamics. At 12:33 hours, the bomber was alone. The formation had pulled ahead. Stragglers attracted fighters like blood in water attracted sharks. Kellerman scanned the sky with his one remaining gun and 19 rounds waiting for the German fighters that would certainly come. They did not come. The Luftwaffe had other targets. Healthier bombers still in formation, a single damaged B-17 falling behind, trailing smoke, losing altitude slowly, was already considered dead. The German fighters had limited fuel and ammunition. They focused on targets that required killing rather than ones already dying. At 13:08 hours, number 2 engine began missing. Fuel starvation from the leaking wing tanks. The pilots adjusted fuel distribution, trying to keep the engine running, but the mathematics were unforgiving. At 13:35 hours, the French coastline appeared ahead. At 13:41 hours, Nighthawk crossed into the English Channel. Altitude 4,200 feet. Engines 3 and 2 dead. Engines 1 and 4 running on diminishing fuel. Distance to the English coast 87 nautical miles. Lieutenant Warren's voice came through the intercom, steady, despite the crisis unfolding around them. Navigator pilot, fuel estimate to English coast. Harrison Caldwell's response came after a pause for calculation. Insufficient, sir. Estimate fuel exhaustion in 8 to 10 minutes. We will not make land. Warren absorbed the information, made his decision, keyed the intercom. This is the pilot. We cannot reach England. Prepare for controlled ditching in the channel. Air-sea rescue has been notified. All crew assume ditching positions. Do not inflate life vests until you are outside the aircraft. Nighthawk has carried us through 20 missions. Let us honor her by all getting home alive. Kellerman remained at his tail position, watching through blood-smeared plexiglass as the grey water of the English Channel grew larger below. One gun functional, 19 rounds remaining, 11 new wounds adding to the 11 scars from Kassel, and a bomber that had 63 seconds of fuel remaining before the final 2 engines died and the glide to the water began. He thought about Bobby Whitmore, who had waited for the manual's prescribed 300 yards and died in the first burst of fire over Saint-Nazaire. He thought about the 1,200 rounds he had loaded that morning and the 19 that remained. He thought about the mathematics of survival, which had carried him through 20 missions but were about to balance against him in the cold water of the Channel. At 14:47 hours, engines 1 and 4 coughed twice and went silent. The dead stick glide began. 3,800 feet of altitude. Approximately 90 seconds until impact. Kellerman unbuckled from his position, assumed crash position, and waited for the water to rise up and claim Nighthawk and everyone aboard her. At 14:47 hours, engines number 1 and 4 died. Fuel starvation. The Wright R1820 Cyclone radials that had powered Nighthawk across thousands of miles of hostile airspace coughed twice, backfired once, and went silent. The sudden absence of sound was more terrifying than any amount of gunfire. The dead stick glide began. Altitude 3,800 feet. Glide ratio for a B-17F in optimal conditions 8:1. Nighthawk was not in optimal conditions. Battle damage had disrupted the airframe's aerodynamics. The controls were sluggish. The wounded bomber fell through the sky like a brick with wings. Lieutenant Warren's voice came through the intercom one final time, calm and professional, despite the mathematics of death bearing down on them. Final approach in 90 seconds. Assume crash positions now. Do not inflate life vests until you are outside the aircraft. Nighthawk has been good to us. Let us honor her by all getting home. In the tail section, Kellerman unbuckled from the bicycle seat that had been his workstation for 20 missions. His flight suit peeled away from the frozen blood that had glued him to the metal. He crouched in the brace position, head down, arms wrapped around his knees, and made whatever peace a 24-year-old man could make in 90 seconds. The statistics for tail gunners in ditching scenarios were not encouraging. 23% survival rate. The tail section typically collapsed on impact, trapping the gunner in a cage of crumpled aluminum that filled with freezing water in seconds. Most tail gunners who survived the war never survived a ditching. Kellerman thought about Bobby Whitmore, who had died following the manual over Saint-Nazaire. He thought about the 7 German pilots he had killed, young men who were somebody's sons, somebody's brothers, fighting for a cause they believed in just as strongly as he believed in his. He thought about the 1,200 rounds he had loaded that morning and the 63 that remained useless now against the English Channel. He thought about his mother in Pennsylvania, who would receive a telegram, missing in action, presumed dead. The telegram would not mention that her son had changed how the Army Air Forces fought. It would not mention the doctrine he had broken or the lives his methods would eventually save. It would just say he was gone. The water rose up to meet them. Impact. The sequence unfolded in slow motion and violent speed simultaneously. The belly of the bomber contacted the Channel's surface at 122 miles per hour. The entire fuselage shuddered, rivets shearing from their holes, aluminum skin buckling under forces it was never designed to withstand. The nose crumpled plexiglass, shattering into a million fragments. The fuselage buckled amidships, structural members snapping like kindling. At one point, 4 seconds after initial impact, the aircraft broke in two. The tail section separated from the main fuselage, the fracture point occurring just aft of the ball turret. The tail tumbled backward, hitting the water a second time with the force of a car crash. Kellerman was thrown forward, his head impacting the gun mount. The world went dark. Sound, metal screaming, water roaring, temperature shock as his body transitioned from minus 52 degrees Fahrenheit inside the aircraft to 54 degrees in the water. The cold hit like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. Vision, blood in his eyes, darkness, spinning, the tail section rolling in the water, filling rapidly, sinking, smell, aviation fuel, seawater, cordite residue still clinging to his flight suit from hours of sustained firing, touch, water rushing in, something grabbed him, hands. Someone was pulling him through the wreckage, dragging him toward light. Kellerman surfaced, gasping, coughing seawater. His life vest was inflated. He had no memory of pulling the toggles. Someone else must have done it, pulled him from the sinking tail section, inflated his vest, saved his life while he was unconscious. He blinked water and blood from his eyes, trying to focus. Nighthawk's tail section was sinking 40 yards away, sliding beneath the grey surface, taking with it the bicycle seat and the guns and 20 missions worth of memories. The main fuselage floated 200 yards distant, already settling lower in the water. Men bobbed in the swells. Kellerman started counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 9. They needed 10. Then 50 feet away, Bombardier Lieutenant Carl Fisher surfaced, coughing violently, fighting to clear water from his lungs. He raised one arm weakly. 10. All 10 crew members alive in the water. The statistics said this was impossible. B-17 ditching success rate in 1943, 47%. Crew survival rate in successful ditchings, 68%. Expected survivors from a 10-man crew, 3.2. Nighthawk's crew, 10 out of 10. The bomber's main fuselage slipped beneath the surface at 15-12 hours. The tail section had already disappeared. 17 missions worth of combat, thousands of miles, flown 7 German fighters, destroyed in a single day. All of it now resting 180 feet below the surface of the English Channel. At 15:37 hours, a Supermarine Walrus amphibious aircraft appeared from the northeast, its single Bristol Pegasus engine growling as it descended toward the water. The RAF Air Sea Rescue Service had received Warren's distress call. The Walrus landed on the Channel's surface, taxied to the nearest life raft, and began recovering survivors. By 15:52 hours, all 10 men were aboard the rescue aircraft, or its accompanying launch. The Walrus pilot, Flight Lieutenant Robert Hammond, looked at the bedraggled bomber crew crowded into his aircraft and shook his head. 10 for 10 from a ditching, he said. I have never seen that, not once. You gentlemen used up about 50 years of luck in 5 minutes. Kellerman, wrapped in a wool blanket, blood still seeping from the wounds on his arms and scalp, said nothing. Luck had nothing to do with it. Warren had executed a perfect ditching. The crew had trained for this scenario. Everyone had done their job exactly right, but he was too exhausted to explain. The Walrus landed at RAF Hawking at 16:23 hours. Ambulances waited on the tarmac. Kellerman was taken directly to the station hospital, where Captain Henderson, the flight surgeon who had treated him after Kassel, examined the new wounds. You are developing a habit of arriving here covered in German shrapnel, Henderson said. I do not recommend continuing this pattern. The wounds were less severe than those from Mission 13. No fragments embedded too deep for removal. No lasting damage. Henderson cleaned and bandaged everything, administered a tetanus shot, and prescribed rest. You are grounded for 1 week, minimum, Henderson said. No arguments. Your body needs time to heal. Kellerman spent the week in the hospital barracks, sleeping 12 hours a day, eating whatever the cooks provided, and trying not to think about Nighthawk resting at the bottom of the channel. Other crew members visited. Navigator Caldwell brought updates on the squadron. 8 aircraft had been lost on the Stuttgart mission. 80 men. The highest single-day casualties the 379th had suffered since deploying to England. But the mission intelligence reports were noting something else. The bombers that returned had documented a pattern. Tail gunners using early engagement techniques had reported fewer direct hits from stern attacks. The German fighters were being forced into defensive maneuvers before establishing stable firing platforms. The correlation between aggressive defensive fire and bomber survival was becoming impossible to ignore. On October 14, 1943, Kellerman stood at attention in his dress uniform while Colonel Preston pinned the Distinguished Service Cross to his chest. The citation was read aloud to the assembled personnel of the 379th Bombardment Group. For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy while serving as tail gunner on a B-17 heavy bomber in the 379th Bombardment Group 8th Air Force during bombing missions over Germany on 30 July 1943 and 6 September 1943. Despite receiving severe wounds from enemy anti-aircraft fire, Staff Sergeant Kellerman continued to engage attacking enemy fighters with exceptional skill and determination, destroying 7 enemy aircraft and enabling his bomber to complete its assigned mission. His aggressive defensive fire tactics disrupted numerous enemy attacks, directly contributing to the survival of his crew and other aircraft in the formation. Staff Sergeant Kellerman's unquestionable valor in aerial combat is in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflects great credit upon himself, the 379th Bombardment Group, and the United States Army Air Forces. The medal felt heavy, heavier than it should have been for a piece of bronze and ribbon. Kellerman thought about Bobby Whitmore, who would never receive any medal because he had followed the doctrine exactly as written. He thought about the 80 men lost on September the 6th, and the 90 lost before July, and all the others who had died because the manual said to wait until 300 yards. The ceremony ended. Kellerman returned to his barracks. The medal went into his footlocker, buried under spare socks and writing paper. While Kellerman was receiving his decoration, the staff officers at 8th Bomber Command headquarters were completing their analysis. The study had taken 6 weeks. 14 bomb groups, 3 months of data, 1,847 missions analyzed, 312 tail gunner engagements studied in detail. The findings were conclusive and damning. Tail gunners who engaged targets beyond 500 yards showed 71% survival rates. Tail gunners who followed standard doctrine and waited until 300 yards showed 34% survival rates. The difference was not marginal. It was the difference between most tail gunners surviving and most tail gunners dying. Ammunition expenditure told a similar story. Gunners who fired fewer than 500 rounds per mission averaged 1.2 kills per 100 missions. Gunners who fired more than 800 rounds per mission averaged 4.1 kills per 100 missions. The increased ammunition cost was 85%, but ammunition could be replaced. Trained aircrew could not. Formation protection data showed that early engagement fire coordinated across multiple bombers reduced overall formation damage by 43%. German fighters forced to maneuver defensively before reaching effective range scored 67% fewer hits on the bombers they attacked. Brigadier General Frederick Anderson, commander of 8th Bomber Command, read the report personally. The implications extended beyond individual aircraft survival. If coordinated early fire from multiple bombers could disrupt mass fighter attacks, the entire defensive doctrine required revision. The doctrine had been written in 1941 by officers who had studied gunnery theory in classrooms, calculated optimal engagement ranges using mathematics and probability, and built training programs around ammunition conservation and fire discipline. The doctrine made perfect sense on paper. In combat, it was killing people. A 24-year-old tail gunner from Pennsylvania with no formal engineering education and no staff officer training had proven through empirical observation and survival instinct that the doctrine was wrong. He had broken the rules, survived, and demonstrated a better way. On November 18, 1943, 8th Bomber Command issued revised gunnery guidelines. The language was careful hedged with bureaucratic qualifications, but the meaning was clear. Tail gunners were authorized to engage targets at extended ranges when tactical conditions permitted. The specific range was not prescribed. The decision was left to the gunner's judgment based on the tactical situation. The approach that had kept Everett Kellerman alive was now official policy. Kellerman never saw the policy take full effect in combat. The head injuries from the ditching proved more serious than initial assessments had indicated. He returned to flight status in late September and completed 3 additional missions. Mission 21 on September 21st produced 1 more confirmed kill, a Bf-109, hit at 490 yards, bringing his final total to 18 confirmed victories. Missions 22 and 23 produced close calls that should not have been close. His vision was degrading. Depth perception issues. Occasional disorientation. He was missing fighters that should have been obvious. The medical board on October 8th was thorough and final. Chronic post-concussion syndrome. Symptoms incompatible with high-altitude operations requiring rapid visual target acquisition. Staff Sergeant Everett Kellerman was permanently grounded from combat flying duties. His combat career ended with 18 confirmed kills, 6 probables, and 23 missions flown. The numbers placed him among the highest-scoring bomber gunners in the 8th Air Force. Some records listed 17 kills instead of 18 due to a disputed confirmation from Mission 13, but the exact number mattered less than what those numbers represented. Kellerman had survived, against statistics that said he should have been dead. After 11 missions, he had flown 23. Against doctrine that said to wait and conserve ammunition, he had fired early and lived. Against the accumulated tactical wisdom of the Army Air Force's gunnery establishment, he had proven that innovation beats doctrine when doctrine is wrong. In January 1944, Kellerman shipped back to the United States and was assigned to the Army Air Force's Gunnery Instruction School at Fort Myers, Florida. His new mission was teaching others the techniques that had kept him alive. The curriculum he developed covered 4 modules. Module 1, titled The Fatal Gap, used mathematics and geometry to demonstrate why the 300-yard doctrine created a 4 to 5 second window where German fighters could fire without receiving return fire. Module 2, Ammunition Philosophy, challenged the traditional emphasis on conservation over effectiveness. Module 3, Reading the Attack, taught students how to identify aircraft types and predict attack angles at ranges exceeding 800 yards. Module 4, One-gun fighting drew directly from Kellerman's experience at Stuttgart, teaching wounded gunner protocols and maintaining effectiveness with degraded capability. Between January 1944 and May 1945, Kellerman trained 1,247 gunners, 340 of those students deployed to combat theaters in Europe and the Pacific. Their confirmed kills totaled 89. More importantly, the estimated number of those students who survived their combat tours using Kellerman's methods ranged between 170 and 230. Every letter Kellerman received from a former student who had survived a combat tour he kept. The letters filled a footlocker. Each one represented a life that might have been lost if the old doctrine had remained in place. Each one was one less Bobby Whitmore. But the letters also carried weight. Survivor's guilt. Why had Kellerman lived when Bobby died? Why had he survived 23 missions when so many others had not? The mathematics said he should have been dead. The statistics said his survival was a statistical anomaly. But he was here training others while Bobby Whitmore rested in a military cemetery in France, and 80 men from the September 6th mission were listed as killed or missing in action. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Japan surrendered in August. The Army Air Forces began demobilization. Most veterans went home, rebuilt civilian lives, tried to forget the things they had seen and done. Kellerman made a different choice. He stayed. In 1947, when the Army Air Forces became the United States Air Force, Kellerman transferred. He continued teaching gunnery tactics, even though the B-17 was being phased out, even though jet aircraft were replacing propeller-driven bombers, even though the specific techniques he had developed were becoming obsolete. The principles remained constant: aggressive defense over passive waiting, innovation over doctrine, thinking over obeying. Those principles transcended specific aircraft or weapons systems. The Korean War erupted in 1950. Kellerman trained B-29 gunners, adapting his methods for different aircraft and different enemies. MiG-15 jet fighters required different engagement ranges than Bf-109s, but the fundamental concept remained the same: disrupt the enemy's attack before he establishes a stable firing platform. In 1955, Kellerman was promoted to Master Sergeant. In 1957, he married Dorothy Sullivan, a schoolteacher from Pensacola. They had 2 children. Kellerman never talked about his combat experiences with his family. The medals stayed in a drawer. The memories stayed locked away. Dorothy would later recall that every year on September the 6th, the anniversary of the Stuttgart mission and the ditching, her husband would go quiet. He would sit in his chair, staring at nothing, not reading, not speaking. When she asked what he was thinking about, he gave the same answer every time. Counting, always counting, bullets, altitude, distance, fuel, whether the math adds up to living or dying. When she asked why he stayed in the Air Force for so long after the war, he said, "Because every gunner I train who comes home is one less Bobby Whitmore. That is reason enough." And Kellerman retired from the Air Force in 1962 after 22 years of service. He took a job as a high school mathematics teacher in St. Augustine, Florida. The students never knew their teacher had 18 confirmed aerial victories. He never mentioned it. Teaching logarithms and trigonometry to teenagers who complained about homework seemed trivial compared to teaching young men how to survive in combat, but it was honest work and it kept his mind occupied. The nightmares never completely stopped. The sound of R-1820 engines, the hammer of 50 caliber guns, the smell of cordite and hydraulic fluid and frozen blood, the faces of German pilots in the seconds before impact, young men doing their duty just as he had done his. The mathematics of survival: 63 rounds, 87 miles, whether the numbers balanced or whether they did not. Harrison Caldwell, Nighthawk's navigator, became a journalist after the war. In 1983, he published a memoir titled The Fall of Fortresses, documenting the experiences of the 379th Bombardment Group during the air war over Europe. An entire chapter was devoted to Everett Kellerman and the doctrine change his methods had produced. Caldwell wrote, "Ev broke the rules because the rules were killing us. He proved that survival requires thinking, not just obeying. The Air Force eventually gave him medals and changed the doctrine. But Ev never cared about that. He cared about the 10 of us in Nighthawk, the crews in our squadron, the gunners he would never meet who would use his methods." On September the 6th, 1943, I watched him count down from 523 rounds to 63, bleeding from 11 wounds, flying home on hope and mathematics. When we hit the water, I thought we were dead. But Ev Kellerman taught me that impossible is just math you have not solved yet. We all made it home because of him. That is his legacy. On February 15th, 1990, Everett Kellerman died peacefully in his sleep at his home in St. Augustine, Florida. Heart failure. He was 70 years old. His wife found him in the morning, still and cold, finally at rest after 7 decades of counting bullets and measuring distances, and calculating whether the numbers added up to survival. The funeral was held on February 20th at the National Memorial Cemetery of Arizona in Phoenix. Military honors, 3-volley salute, taps played by a young airman who had never heard of the B-17 flying fortress or the doctrine that Staff Sergeant Kellerman had broken. The flag was folded and presented to Dorothy Kellerman, who accepted it with dry eyes and steady hands. The headstone was standard government issue, white marble, simple inscription, Everett Kellerman, MSGT, U.S. Air Force, World War II, Korea, 1919 to 1990. No mention of 18 confirmed kills. No mention of the doctrine he had changed. No mention of the 1,247 gunners he had trained, or the estimated hundreds of lives his methods had saved. Military cemeteries are full of such understatements. The stones mark names and dates but cannot capture the weight of what those names represent. Kellerman lies among thousands of other veterans at the Arizona Cemetery, each with stories that deserve telling, each with contributions that exceeded what could be carved into marble. Row upon row of white stones, identical, except for the names and dates, a democracy of the dead where privates and generals rest as equals. The mighty 8th Air Force Museum in Savannah, Georgia, preserves the history of the bomber crews who flew from England between 1942 and 1945. The 379th Bombardment Group's records are archived there, including mission reports that document Kellerman's combat achievements. Researchers studying the evolution of defensive gunnery tactics can trace the doctrine change through documents that bear his influence. The B-17 tail gunner position no longer exists. The aircraft that carried men like Kellerman into combat have mostly vanished, reduced to museum pieces and memorial displays. The few airworthy examples fly at air shows their gun positions empty, their missions consisting of entertainment flights for paying passengers who will never know what it felt like to sit in that tail position at 25,000 feet with the Luftwaffe coming head-on. But the principles Kellerman demonstrated endure. The value of aggressive action over passive defense, the willingness to challenge doctrine that is getting people killed, the courage to trust your judgment when everyone says you are wrong, the recognition that sometimes survival requires breaking the rules written by people who have never faced the situation you are facing. Those principles apply beyond aerial combat. They apply to any situation where established doctrine conflicts with observed reality. When the manual says one thing but experience says another, which do you trust? When the experts who wrote the rules have never done the job, do you follow their guidance or your own judgment? When obedience means death and innovation means survival, what choice do you make? Everett Kellerman made his choice at 24 years old, sitting alone in the tail of a bomber over occupied France, watching a friend die because he followed the manual. The choice was simple: break the rules or die by them. He chose to break them. He survived. He changed how the United States Air Force fought. He saved lives he would never meet, trained gunners he would never see in combat, influenced tactics that would outlive him by generations. The men who wrote the manual never sat in a tail gunner position at 25,000 feet, with fighters coming at 600 miles per hour, combined closure rate. Kellerman did. And when the manual's mathematics did not add up to survival, he wrote his own equations. 63 rounds remaining, 87 miles to safety. The numbers did not balance. But Kellerman had stopped trusting the numbers written by other people. He trusted what he had learned through 20 missions and 7 confirmed kills in a single day, and the knowledge that Bobby Whitmore had died following the rules. The English Channel rose up to meet Nighthawk at 122 miles per hour. The bomber broke in half. 10 men went into the water. 10 men came out alive. Impossible according to the statistics. Miraculous according to the rescue crews. Inevitable according to Kellerman, because impossible is just mathematics you have not solved yet. The rules said wait until 300 yards. Kellerman fired at 800. That made all the difference. His headstone does not say so. But the absence of names on other headstones, the men who came home because a tail gunner in Pennsylvania decided the doctrine was wrong, those absent names are his true memorial. The lives lived instead of lost. The families that remained whole instead of shattered. The letters in a footlocker from students who survived. Everett Kellerman. 18 confirmed kills, doctrine changed, 1,247 gunners trained, thousands of lives saved. remembered by few, honored by those who know. The doctrine said to wait. He fired early, and the mathematics of survival shifted in favor of the men who followed his example. That is the story. That is the legacy. That is what the simple headstone in Arizona cannot say, but what the historical record preserves. Sometimes the greatest heroism is not following orders. Sometimes it is knowing when the orders are wrong and having the courage to do what is right instead. Kellerman knew. And because he knew others lived,